In June of 1944, American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division landed in the fields behind Utah Beach. Within hours, Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment radioed a message that confused everyone who heard it. His unit had just captured 4 Asian men wearing German military uniforms. Nobody in the regiment could communicate with them. Nobody could explain what they were doing there. And nobody, at that moment, understood that these 4 nameless prisoners carried on their bodies the entire map of the 20th century's cruelty. Not because of who they were, but because of what had been done to them. This is not the story you think it is. This is a story about a man who may never have existed, a system that absolutely did, and the uncomfortable reason the world needed a myth to notice a truth it had been ignoring for decades. To understand how 4 Asian men ended up in Nazi uniforms on a beach in Normandy, you need to understand what Korea was in 1938. Not the Korea of K-pop and Samsung, not the Korea of the Korean War. A Korea that had not been its own country for nearly 3 decades. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. After years of forced treaties, assassinations, and the systematic dismantling of Korean sovereignty. By the late 1930s, Korea was not a colony in the way most people imagine colonies. It was something closer to a consumed identity. The Japanese colonial government, known as the Government General of Korea, controlled every institution: courts, police, schools, press. The Korean language was being pushed out of classrooms. Korean newspapers were censored or shut down, and starting in 1939, under the Soshikaime policy, Koreans would be pressured to abandon their family names, names that connected them to ancestral lines stretching back centuries, and adopt Japanese names instead. But before they came for the names, they came for the bodies. In 1938, the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria began accepting Korean recruits, officially as volunteers. The reality was something else. Korea was being used, in the words of historians, as a breadbasket and a pool of manpower to fuel Japan's conquests. Young Korean men in Manchuria, which Japan had seized in 1931 and renamed Manchukuo, were conscripted into the Kwantung Army. By the end of the colonial period, over 213,000 Koreans had served in the Japanese military. Over 22,000 of them died. Hundreds of thousands more were conscripted as forced laborers, sent to mines, factories, construction sites, and military installations across Japan's empire. Of the 670,000 taken to mainland Japan alone, an estimated 60,000 perished. In Korea and Manchuria, deaths among forced laborers ranged between 270,000 and 810,000. These are not approximations of tragedy. They are the arithmetic of empire. Among those early Korean conscripts in Manchuria, some were sent to the front lines of a conflict that most people outside of military history have never heard of. In the summer of 1939, Japanese and Soviet forces collided at a remote river on the Mongolian-Manchurian border called Khalkhin-Gol. The Japanese knew it as the Nomonhan incident. The Soviets would remember it as a proving ground for a young general named Georgy Zhukov, the same Zhukov who would later lead the Red Army to Berlin. The battle at Khalkhin-Gol was not small. Over 100,000 troops fought across months of escalating engagements. More than 1,000 tanks and aircraft were deployed. Japanese casualties reached as high as 20,000 or more, depending on the source. Soviet losses were also severe, possibly between 21 and 24,000. When the fighting ended in September of 1939, the Japanese Kwantung Army had been decisively defeated. Among those captured by the Soviet Red Army were soldiers who had not chosen to be there in the first place. Korean conscripts, 18, 19, 20 years old. Men who had been pulled from Manchurian villages and given Japanese uniforms and Japanese rifles and told to fight Russians on a steppe they had never seen for a cause they had no stake in. When they surrendered or were captured, they were not sent home. There was no mechanism for that. Korea did not exist as a sovereign entity. They belonged to no one. The Soviets sent them where they sent everyone they did not need and could not trust. To the gulags. Forced labor camps scattered across the vast frozen geography of the Soviet Union. These men dug, hauled, froze, and waited. Some for years. And then, in 1942, the Soviet Union started running out of soldiers. The Eastern Front against Nazi Germany had consumed men at a rate that defied comprehension. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead, captured, or wounded. Entire army groups had been encircled and destroyed. The German advance had reached the outskirts of Moscow, besieged Leningrad, and was pushing towards Stalingrad. The Soviet government, desperate for replacements, began doing what desperate governments do. They emptied the labor camps and conscripted the prisoners. This was not an act of liberation. It was a transfer of one form of captivity to another. Men who had been digging trenches and hauling timber were given Soviet rifles and Soviet uniforms and shipped to the worst fighting in human history. The Eastern Front. Among those pressed into the Red Army were prisoners from Khalkhin Gol, former Japanese soldiers, Manchurian conscripts, Koreans who had already been forced to fight once for an empire that was not theirs. Now they would fight again. Different uniform, different language of command, same absence of choice. The Eastern Front in early 1943 was a landscape of industrial death. The Third Battle of Kharkov, fought between February and March of that year, was one of the most brutal engagements of the war. Soviet forces, riding the momentum of their victory at Stalingrad, pushed westward into Ukraine. The Germans, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, launched a devastating counterattack. The battle seesawed through the streets and outskirts of Kharkov, today's Kharkiv, with appalling casualties on both sides. Entire Soviet units were surrounded and destroyed. And among the thousands of Red Army soldiers captured by the Wehrmacht during this German counterstroke were men who had already been prisoners twice before. Here, the machinery of war performed its next rotation. The German military, like the Soviet military, was hemorrhaging manpower. The solution was the Osttruppen, Eastern troops. The system was formalized, but had its roots in the improvised decisions of frontline commanders who realized that prisoners of war could be recycled into soldiers. By late 1943, the Wehrmacht had incorporated over 427,000 foreign conscripts and so-called volunteers into its ranks. They came from every territory Germany had conquered or fought across: Ukrainians, Georgians, Turkestani, Armenians, Cossacks, and others. They were organized into Ostbataillon, Eastern battalions, and given German uniforms, German weapons, and German orders. Many had no loyalty to the Nazi cause. Many had no choice. The alternative to volunteering was starvation, execution, or indefinite imprisonment in a German POW camp where survival rates for Soviet prisoners were catastrophically low. Among these hundreds of thousands of recycled soldiers, some had traveled a path that stretched across continents and ideologies. Conscripted by one empire, captured by a second, forced to fight for a third, captured again, forced to fight for a fourth. Each time wearing a different uniform, each time fighting for a nation that viewed them as expendable material, each time further from home. The Ostbataillon were not trusted with critical combat roles. They were sent to what the German High Command considered secondary theaters: coastal defense, rear area security, anti-partisan operations. In 1944, many of these battalions were stationed along the Atlantic Wall in occupied France, guarding beaches and ports that the Germans believed the Allies might one day attack. The 709th Static Infantry Division was one of the formations responsible for defending the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, the area that included Utah Beach. The division was a patchwork of the Wehrmacht's leftovers: older reservists, soldiers recovering from wounds, poorly trained recruits, and a significant contingent of Osttruppen. Foreign auxiliaries made up an estimated 25 to 30% of the division's infantry strength. Among the units attached to the 709th were the 795th Georgian Battalion, the 461st Ost Battalion, and the 649th Ost Battalion. These were men from the Soviet Union's periphery, Georgians, Turkestani, Central Asians, and, according to at least one American officer's account, Koreans. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, the division's commander, would later write critically about the unreliability of these non-German troops. He noted their reluctance to fight effectively, their minimal training, and their equipment shortages. He was describing, without irony, the predictable behavior of men who had been captured, starved, and forced into yet another army. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces stormed 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. At Utah Beach, the American assault met comparatively lighter resistance than at Omaha, just 197 American casualties during the initial assault phase. The 709th Division, undermanned, undertrained, and internally fractured by its reliance on reluctant foreign troops, crumbled under the combined weight of naval bombardment, air superiority, and paratroop landings behind the beach. In the chaos, Lieutenant Robert Brewer's paratroopers captured 4 men who did not look like the Germans, the Georgians, or the Turkestani they had been briefed to expect. These 4 men had East Asian features. They wore Wehrmacht uniforms. They could not speak English. They could not speak German. Brewer initially reported them as Japanese soldiers in German uniforms, a reasonable assumption for an American officer in 1944 who had never encountered a Korean before. The 4 men were sent to a prisoner of war camp in Britain. Their names were not recorded in any surviving document that historians have been able to locate. Their faces may or may not appear in a photograph that has circulated since the early 2000s. A black and white image from the U.S. National Archives showing a young Asian man in Wehrmacht attire being processed as a prisoner on a Normandy beach. The original caption in the archives identifies him simply as a young Japanese man, and it is at this photograph that the story fractures. In 2002, a Korean news outlet published an article connecting the Brewer account to a name, Yang Kyung-jong. According to the emerging narrative, Yang was a Korean man born in 1920 who had been conscripted by the Japanese at 18, captured by the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol, forced into the Red Army, captured by the Germans at Kharkov, forced into the Wehrmacht, and finally captured by the Americans at Utah Beach. After the war, the story went, he immigrated to the United States, became a citizen, settled near Northwestern University in Illinois, married, had children, and died quietly in 1992 without ever telling his story publicly. The narrative was irresistible. It became the basis for Anthony Beevor's framing in his book, The Second World War, where he opens and closes with Yang's story. Beever called him perhaps the most striking illustration of the helplessness of most ordinary mortals in the face of overwhelming historical forces. Stephen Zaloga wrote about him in The Devil's Garden, his account of Omaha Beach's defenses. Stephen Ambrose referenced the Brewer account, though not the name Yang, in his book D-Day, June 6, 1944. In 2011, South Korea produced My Way, a film loosely based on Yang's story, with a budget of $23 million. It was billed as the most expensive Korean film ever made at the time. There was only one problem. In December of 2005, the Seoul Broadcasting System aired a special documentary titled The Korean in Normandy. A professional investigative team was dispatched to verify what had become a national story. They searched the archives of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol for records of Korean prisoners of war. They searched Soviet records for Korean servicemen who had been transferred from labor camps to the Red Army. They searched German records of the Ostbataillon for any trace of a Korean soldier named Yang Kyung-jong. They investigated the claim that he had lived near Northwestern University in Illinois and died there in 1992. They found nothing. The documentary concluded that while there had indeed been Asian soldiers serving in the German army during World War II, this was well documented. There was no clear evidence for the existence of an individual named Yang Kyung-jong. The biographical details could not be confirmed. The immigration records yielded nothing. The death records yielded nothing. The name appeared in no military archive of any of the 4 nations he was said to have served. Historian Martin K. A. Morgan went further. He examined the famous photograph and concluded that the man in the image was more likely an ethnic Georgian from the 795th Georgian Battalion, a unit that was, in fact, attached to the 709th Division and stationed near Utah Beach. Morgan stated bluntly that Yang Kyung-jong is a person who never existed, because he certainly never left us any proof that he ever existed. The SBS production team added another devastating detail. Under a secret agreement between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, former Soviet soldiers who had been captured and forced into German service were to be forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union after the war. There, they were treated as traitors and sent to gulags. The claim that Yang had simply waltzed into American citizenship, avoiding forced repatriation that consumed tens of thousands of Osttruppen prisoners, was, the investigators concluded, implausible without any supporting documentation. So the most famous Korean story of the Second World War is, in all likelihood, a story about a person who did not exist. And here is where the real weight of this history lands, because the system that would have produced Yang Kyung-jong was entirely, mercilessly, documentably real. 213,719 Koreans served in the Japanese military. 22,182 of them died. 5,400,000 were conscripted for forced labor. Hundreds of thousands perished in mines, factories, and construction sites across an empire that stretched from Manchuria to the Pacific Islands. On the Tarawa Atoll alone, only 129 of 1,200 Korean laborers survived the battle. Japanese records contain testimonies that Korean laborers on the Mealy Atoll were fed human flesh, the remains of other dead Koreans, and when they rebelled after discovering the truth, they were killed by the dozens. The Soviets captured thousands of soldiers at Khalkhin Gol. They pressed prisoners into the Red Army from camps across Siberia and Central Asia. The Germans absorbed over 400,000 foreign conscripts into their military machine. The 709th Division alone was 1/4 to 1/3 foreign troops at Normandy, and among all of these, documented, numbered, archived movements of human beings used as interchangeable parts by competing empires. Brewer's 4 Asians remain nameless. Not unnamed because their names were unimportant. Unnamed because no one in any of the 4 armies that used them, Japanese, Soviet, German, or American, bothered to write them down. The myth of Yang Kyung-jong filled a vacuum. It gave a name and a biography to a systemic reality that was too large and too diffuse to hold the world's attention without a protagonist. The world does not mourn systems. It mourns individuals. And when no verified individual could be found, one was created, not through malice, but through the very human need to put a face on suffering that would otherwise remain statistical. Anthony Beaver was not wrong about the meaning. He was wrong about the man. The helplessness of ordinary mortals in the face of overwhelming historical forces did not require Yang Kyung-jong to be real. It required Korea under Japanese rule. It required the gulags. It required the Osttruppen. It required Utah Beach. All of those things are documented beyond any dispute. What remains undocumented, what may remain undocumented forever, are the 4 actual men that Lieutenant Brewer captured on that June morning in 1944. Were they Korean? Brewer said they were. Were they conscripted into the Japanese army first? Ambrose wrote that it seemed so, based on Brewer's account. Were they captured at Khalkhin Gol, forced into the Red Army, captured again at the Eastern Front, forced into the Wehrmacht, and shipped to Normandy? That was Brewer's understanding. Did they survive the war? Ambrose speculated they may have been returned to Korea and fought in the Korean War. He admitted their fate was unknown. 4 men, 4 possible journeys across 5 or 6 years, and 3 or 4 armies and half the globe. No names, no photographs that can be conclusively linked to them, no grave markers, no memoirs, no descendants who have come forward. The most extraordinary odyssey of the Second World War. And it belongs to ghosts. In 2011, when the film My Way premiered to audiences worldwide, it told the story of a Korean and a Japanese man thrown together across the battlefields of Khalkhin Gol, the Eastern Front, and Normandy. The budget was $23 million. The cast included some of South Korea's biggest stars. The marketing emphasized that the story was based on true events. The archives tell a different story. They tell a story of systems, not individuals. Of the Kwantung Army's insatiable demand for bodies. Of the Soviet Union's willingness to feed prisoners into its own meat grinder. Of Germany's industrial approach to recycling captured soldiers. Of the American military's inability to identify or communicate with men whose journey across the war defied every assumption about who fought for whom and why. And they tell the story of Korea, a nation that lost its sovereignty in 1910 and would not fully regain it until 1948, split into 2 states that remain divided to this day. A nation whose people were used as raw material by the Japanese Empire, scattered across Asia as soldiers and laborers, and then, when the war ended, largely forgotten by the powers that had consumed them. In 1965, when Japan and South Korea signed a normalization treaty, the question of compensation for forced laborers and military conscripts became one of the most contentious issues in East Asian diplomacy. It remains unresolved. In 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court ordered Japanese companies to compensate Korean forced laborers, a ruling Japan rejected, citing the 1965 treaty. The dispute continues. The laborers, most of them, are dead. Their children are aging. The archives remain. The 4 men on Utah Beach are somewhere in those archives, or they are nowhere at all. Perhaps they were repatriated to the Soviet Union and disappeared into the gulags, as the SBS investigators suggested was the likely fate of Osttruppen prisoners. Perhaps one of them really did make it to Illinois. Perhaps they were returned to Korea and lived through the Korean War without ever speaking about what they had endured. No document confirms any of these endings. What the documents do confirm is this. The Japanese Empire took more than 200,000 Korean men and made them into soldiers. The Soviet Union captured some of them and made them into prisoners, then into soldiers again. The German Reich captured some of those and made them into soldiers once more. And the Allied forces captured some of those and could not even determine what language they spoke. 4 armies, 4 uniforms, not one of them Korean, not one of them chosen. And among the 4 men on that beach, not one name that history recorded. Yang Kyung-jong may never have existed, but the world he supposedly lived in, a world where a Korean man could be passed like a piece of equipment from one empire to the next, fighting and bleeding for causes that had nothing to do with his own survival, let alone his freedom. That world is documented in archives in Tokyo, Moscow, Berlin, Washington, and Seoul. It is documented in conscription records and Gulag manifests and Wehrmacht rosters and POW processing forms. The first thing Lieutenant Brewer noticed about the 4 men was that they were Asian and wearing German uniforms. The last thing anyone ever recorded about them was that no one could communicate with them. Between those 2 facts lies the entire history of Korea in the 20th century, a nation spoken about, fought over, divided, and exploited by every major power on Earth, and never once asked what it wanted. The photograph in the National Archives still bears its original caption, "Young Japanese Man." He was not Japanese. He may not have been the man the internet says he was, but he was someone, and no empire that used him, not Japan, not the Soviet Union, not Germany, not the United States, ever cared enough to learn his name.